He made an agreement with the European Union, and it is unknown how much this may affect relations between the United States, China, and Russia. The signed agreements effectively push Russia out of the European market. Donald Trump has been actively promoting his golf courses in Scotland, emphasizing their deal-making appeal. He invited Ursula von der Leyen to his golf course, where a trade deal was announced at a joint press conference with his administration and the European Union administration.
Хорошо заключаются сделки. Именно туда, на свое поле для гольфа, буквально, практически, он вызвал Урсулу фон дер Ляйен и там объявил на пресс-конференции с журналистами, представители и своей администрации, они там присутствовали, и представители администрации Евросоюза объявил о сделке, о торговой сделке.
This can be called a victory for Donald Trump. He concluded a trade agreement with Japan, 15%, with Vietnam, 20%, with the Philippines and Indonesia, 19% each. Negotiations continue with South Korea, Taiwan, China, Canada, Mexico, and Switzerland. The 15% duty will come into effect on August 1st.
Заключил 15%, Вьетнам 20%, Филиппины, Индонезия по 19%. Продолжаются переговоры с Южной Кореей, Тайванем, Китаем, Канадой, Мексикой и Швейцарией. И вот что же это такое 15% пошлина, действительно, с 1 августа.
The basic duty is 15%. Donald Trump identified strategic sectors which include aircraft parts, chemicals, semiconductors, and some agricultural products, for which reciprocal zero duties are imposed. Markets reacted positively to the measures. Economists noted that it was possible to prevent tariff increases, and the situation was more favorable for the U.S. than expected, especially compared to the forecasts of European experts.
Действительно отметили, что предотвращен рост всяческих тарифов, и в целом ситуация более выгодная для США, в общем-то, но при этом гораздо лучше, чем многие ожидали. Вообще ситуация гораздо лучше, чем многие европейские ожидали специалисты.
On the one hand, it is Donald Trump's economic adventure. On the other hand, it is the end of the period of uncertainty in the spheres of metals, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, and other strategically important areas. The situation is gradually normalizing. Donald Trump has repeatedly stated about the unfair attitude of Europe to the United States. But under the new agreements, the European Union is forced to purchase energy resources from the United States to the amount of $750 billion. These EU commitments were announced by Donald Trump at an event where Ursula von der Leyen was also present, which allows us to assume the credibility of the statement, despite the lack of a published text.
Дональд Трамп, и рядом сидела Урсула фон дер Ляйен, поэтому даже раз текст не опубликован, все равно мы предполагаем, что так оно и есть.
The European Union has pledged to buy $750 billion worth of energy resources from the United States. This decision raises concerns in the Kremlin, as previously natural resources were purchased mainly from Russia. Germany, for example, purchased $2 billion worth of Russian natural resources. Now, under the new EU commitments, Russia is gradually being pushed out of the European energy market. This is not a matter of speculation, but of officially declared commitments.
Это обязательство, это не какие-то там предположения или что-то, или давайте будем двигаться. Это обязательства. 750 миллиардов долларов. Вот такие обязательства абсолютные.
The European Union has pledged to buy $750 billion worth of energy resources from the United States. This decision raises concerns in the Kremlin, as previously natural resources were purchased mainly from Russia. Germany, for example, purchased $2 billion worth of Russian natural resources. Now, under the new EU commitments, Russia is gradually being pushed out of the European energy market. This is not a matter of speculation, but of officially declared commitments. Yes, Alexandra. When I learned of the treaty, I immediately started looking for quotes from Ursula von der Leyen rather than Donald Trump, as his statements are well known, but reliable sources are more important. I would also like to discuss Sile Witkoff, who was absent from the news field for a long time and then showed up and gave an interview to Fox News saying he hoped to stop the war before the end of Donald Trump's cadence. It has already been 3.5 years since the conflict began. In this context, one can recall the interview of the Austrian foreign minister, in which she said that Donald Trump allegedly hoped that handing over 4 regions of Ukraine, including Crimea, as well as granting Ukraine neutral status, would convince Vladimir Putin to stop the war. But he went further. Witkoff also expressed the view that referendums had been held in which the people of those regions allegedly wanted to join the Russian Federation. Perhaps the White House has reconsidered its position, having realized that this way the conflict will not end, and is now adjusting its approach to relations with Russia, not turning directly to Ukraine, but changing its strategy. Donald Trump himself is changing his approach. He has a growing understanding of the process. He was really confident that he could reach an agreement with Vladimir Putin. Presumably, if Donald Trump was discussing or expressing an opinion about regions, including Crimea, it could have been about the territorial entities known as the Orlo and Crimea.
Обсуждал или каким-то образом выражал свое мнение относительно вот тех регионов и Крыма, соответственно, то, что принято было назвать Ордло и Крыма.
If Donald Trump expressed an opinion about regions, including Crimea, it was not about legal recognition, but about de facto recognition, similar to the situation with the Baltic states in 1940, when the Soviet Union occupied them. At that time, the State Department recognized the fact of occupation, but not the legal right of the USSR. Presumably, Donald Trump may have expressed similar ideas. It turns out that making a deal with Vladimir Putin is impossible. Donald Trump, who seeks numerous and lucrative financial deals, including deals with Russia, has spoken with Vladimir Putin on numerous occasions, but to no avail. The topics of conversation have been about personal things, grandchildren, movies, and general conversations, but none of the meetings have resulted in concrete agreements. Donald Trump, despite his desire to make favorable deals, remains a representative of the business approach. The American saying, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me," illustrates a situation in which Trump, in his opinion, has been fooled 6 times. Each phone call with Vladimir Putin was followed by attacks on Ukraine, including strikes on peaceful Ukrainian cities, and none of the attempts to negotiate were successful. Donald Trump, despite his eagerness to make deals, can't help but notice what's going on. Melania Trump may have brought the situation to his attention, but he probably realizes things himself. It is difficult for him to admit mistakes, as he publicly positions himself as a man who does not make mistakes. Nevertheless, what is happening suggests that he is beginning to realize the complexity and multi-component nature of the current situation. Donald Trump has ideological and historical differences with Vladimir Putin, which precludes the possibility of reaching adequate agreements. Marco Rubio publicly comments on the situation, increasing attention to what is happening. There is a change of political line. There is no clear turn towards Ukraine, but there is a turn away from Russia towards Europe. Donald Trump is probably stunned in his own way by what is happening. Europe must take responsibility for the purchase of military equipment, because the realization of the protracted nature of the conflict is now present.
И поворот скорее к Европе. И вот хотелось бы, чтобы Европа брала на себя ответственность, закупала вот это огромный объем оборудования военного и так далее. Пусть Европа этим занимается, но то, что это не закончится быстро, вот это понимание уже теперь есть.
The deal, which envisages the purchase of energy resources from the United States by the European Union, can be seen as an alternative to the bill by Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal. The new bill proposes high duties on countries buying energy from Russia. However, the agreement with the U.S. avoids such duties, offering an economic alternative to Russian supplies and helping reduce Europe's dependency on Russian gas and oil. The main thing in the issue of duties is pressure on countries that buy Russian natural resources. This pressure is manifested in particular through India, which is exploring alternative sources of supply. The U.S. can support this trend by concluding more favorable agreements with India that imply obligations to purchase energy resources either from the U.S. or from U.S. partners.
И с Индией заключать более выгодные, например, договоренности именно, так сказать, на этой основе, в том числе, имея обязательства Индии, может быть, закупать у США, а может быть, закупать у американских партнеров.
This will all be legally formalized, including obligations to purchase natural resources from alternative sources. This is part of an overall pressure scheme. It is especially important that India is taking such steps. This is a significant signal that is causing tension in the Kremlin. As for China and Brazil, especially China, the most difficult negotiations are expected because China has no intention of buying energy resources from the U.S. It prefers to look for an alternative, perhaps in Latin American countries, but Russian supplies remain favorable because of the low price. All these are elements of pressure.
Они захотят закупать в другом месте. Да, может быть, в странах Латинской Америки. Но России просто выгоднее из-за того, что Россия так дешево это продает. Вот что, вот почему. Но в любом случае это, конечно, все элементы того самого давления.
Ursula von der Leyen held a meeting with Xi Jinping in Beijing that was shortened to one day and was described by her as a turning point. Europe appears to favor the U.S. over China, with no signs of rapprochement. A third U.S.-China meeting is set for Stockholm, following earlier talks in Geneva and London. These strategic discussions reflect shifting trade and energy dynamics. Under Trump, relations with China may stabilize through pragmatic cooperation, though not full reconciliation. China plays a key role in the global economy, including for the United States. The European Union has failed to make significant progress in negotiations with China, which has caused disappointment among European politicians and experts. The lack of visible success emphasizes the difficulty of building partnerships. China has significant economic potential and can afford to take its time in concluding agreements.
Плюс это Китай, это та сила, которая может позволить себе, ну, скажем так, сразу не договариваться.
China acts similarly to its actions in its relations with the U.S. It is not in a hurry to reach an agreement, accepts duties, demonstrating its willingness to see how it will affect the other side. Economic resilience allows China to sustain itself sufficiently and avoid the need for urgent decisions.
Себя, так сказать, обеспечивать в достаточной мере, чтобы не опасаться и не требуется каких-то немедленных срочных движений.
For Donald Trump, relations with China have always been competitive. His first presidential term began in 2016 with a trade war with China, which was part of his economic policy. Later, the situation was complicated by the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Xi Jinping has certainly not forgotten the beginning of trade conflicts initiated by the U.S. Under the current circumstances, normalization of U.S.-China relations is a diplomatic task in its own right. We already ironically give Donald Trump a Nobel Prize and an Oscar if he is genuinely concerned about the situation in Ukraine and not annoyed with Vladimir Putin. In that case, his diplomatic efforts deserve an award. If Trump manages to normalize relations with China, that would also be a significant achievement, especially since he started out confrontational. Now there are attempts at dialogue, including talks with China on strategic stability and nuclear weapons.
В том числе переговоры с Китаем по стратегической стабильности, по ядерному оружию.
The issue of discussing nuclear weapons with Russia and China is a critical issue for Donald Trump. Negotiations with China represent a serious challenge for both the United States and Trump himself. If he manages to make progress, it will greatly improve bilateral relations. At the same time, Europe is having difficulties in establishing a dialogue with China. European countries are now finding it much more difficult to reach an agreement with Beijing.
У Европы все гораздо хуже сейчас происходит с Китаем. Им гораздо сложнее сейчас как-то с Китаем договориться.
Donald Trump has assumptions about how to engage with China, what steps are possible, where it is acceptable to apply pressure. He obviously has formed not tactics, but a strategy, far-reaching plans in relation to China. In this context, Donald Trump's possible visit to Beijing for a meeting in early September, timed to coincide with a military parade commemorating the end of World War II in the Pacific, is being considered.
Действительно на встречу в Пекин в начале сентября, когда будет военный парад в Пекине. Этот военный парад происходит в связи с окончанием Второй мировой войны на Азиатско-Тихоокеанском регионе.
In early September, China traditionally commemorates the end of World War II, using a different timeline than Europe and the United States. The United States was also involved in military action in the Asia-Pacific theater, which is a significant part of American history. Emerging opportunities to meet during this period represent important diplomatic points for Donald Trump. That said, Marco Rubio remains persona non grata in China, which also reflects current political tensions.
Очень важно то, о чем мы тоже с вами уже говорили относительно Марко Рубио, что он персона нон грата в Китае.
The fact that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been officially banned from entering China raises interest in the upcoming events in September. It represents a political message from the U.S. side. Despite active negotiations, this appointment reflects the complex strategic game of Donald Trump, who prefers to work according to his own schemes. According to multiple sources from his administration, he has a clear goal and strategy, although tactics are often absent.
Игра Дональда Трампа, вот он любит эти какие-то некоторые свои схемы, при этом, как много раз подчеркивали, огромное количество источников, люди, которые работали в администрации Дональда Трампа, вот у него есть цель, вот эта стратегия, тактики у него часто нет.
According to people who worked in Donald Trump's administration during his first term, as reflected in many memoirs, he often came to negotiations without a pre-prepared plan, without sequential points A, B, C, D, E. He had a goal, and he believed that his charisma and powers of persuasion were sufficient to achieve it. Whether this approach will succeed with China is unknown, but China remains an extremely important element of U.S. foreign policy. Marco Rubio said in an interview with the Financial Times that Donald Trump is running out of patience with Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. In the conversation, Rubio also responded to a question about possible presidential ambitions, calling his good friend J.D. Vance and expressing the opinion that Vance would be a worthy next president.
Был бы хорошим следующим президентом. Насколько вы считаете, Александра, это искренне? Насколько они реально друзья хорошие? Или это все-таки политика от Марко Рубио?
Marco Rubio is a politician to the core. He has spent his entire life in politics. Unlike J.D. Vance, who used to be a liberal, compared Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler, and then became a senator from Ohio. Before that, he wrote books and gave public speeches. Marco Rubio began his political career from the Institute bench, volunteered extensively with local Republican politicians, started in Florida, and has had a long career path.
А Марко Рубио, вот уж это политик всю жизнь, начиная с институтской скамьи. Он всегда был в политике и волонтерил с разными республиканскими местными политиками. Изначально начинал во Флориде, очень долгую карьеру проделал.
Marco Rubio is a classic Reagan-esque Republican, not of the MAGA movement, not a typical representative of Donald Trump's administration. He is out of her composition, and at the beginning of his appointment caused great distrust of Donald Trump. According to a number of American political analysts, Trump's proposal to appoint Marco Rubio as Secretary of State may have been a concession to the traditional Republican Party.
Американисты об этом говорили, именно американские, о том, что Марко Рубио и то, что Дональд Трамп предложил его на должность госсекретаря, это такая уступка старой доброй республиканской партии.
According to John Bolton, Donald Trump's former national security advisor, The appointment of Marco Rubio as Secretary of State was a temporary concession and was expected to keep him in the position until August. This statement was made by Bolton at the beginning of Donald Trump's term. However, thanks to his professionalism and deep understanding of political processes, Marco Rubio, who has headed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for many years, is holding on to his position. Marco Rubio has a good understanding of the structure of international relations and the mechanism of their functioning. He has gradually earned the trust of Donald Trump, despite harsh criticism from supporters of the MAGA movement. He has to repeatedly reaffirm his loyalty to Trumpism, but he continues to be distrusted. He is regularly recalled for his hawkish stances on issues involving Russia and China. Articles about Marco Rubio influencing Donald Trump's change of position towards a tougher attitude towards the Kremlin have irritated supporters of the MAGA movement, who believe that Donald Trump himself knows how best to act. They perceive Marco Rubio, with his traditional Republican views, as a man with outdated ideas. His stance, in their opinion, has a negative impact on the current situation. As a result, Marco Rubio is constantly forced to justify himself, convincing that he is not a threat and fully supports the principles of Trumpism. Marco Rubio has emphatically stated that he will not run, believing it to be premature. However, it is possible that he will change his position. To keep his position as Secretary of State or National Security Advisor, he has to publicly support J.D. Vance, emphasizing his virtues. In Donald Trump's administration, many staffers have expressed interest in the presidential campaign and are considering getting involved.
Вообще в администрации Трампа много людей, которые, так сказать, посматривают в сторону овального кабинета и посматривают и хотели бы.
The U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, who is actively engaged in securing the border and implementing the immigration policy of Donald Trump's administration, often appears with him and publicly presents these initiatives. Judging by current signals, she is showing interest in participating in the presidential race. And this is not excluded, although it is premature to talk about it at this stage. Marco Rubio reaffirms loyalty, positioning himself as a non-threatening advisor on international affairs. His praise for J.D. Vance reflects a political strategy akin to Trump-era intra-party dynamics.
Поэтому, мне кажется, это чистая политика, такая вот карточный домик, как он есть.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was very well explained. I also wanted to ask you, do you remember the name of the party, the Democratic Party of the United States of America? The Wall Street Journal wrote that the Democrats' ratings have plummeted to their lowest level in 35 years. I'd like to clarify, is what's happening now, very low ratings, is that always the case when a Democratic or Republican president comes in, or is the other party just silent? Or is this an anomaly? There's a real anomaly going on right now. The Democratic Party is in absolute disarray. There is no understanding of why the party lost. There are still voices, including some prominent Democrats, that the reason for the defeat was that Kamala Harris ran for president too late. This is attributed to time constraints, not politics. The Wall Street Journal study cites an important poll that reflects the current situation.
Только потому, что Камала Харрис поздно выдвинулась на пост президента. И это не связано с политикой, это не связано, просто мало времени у нее было. Ну, конечно, может быть и можно это предполагать, но есть вот в том самом исследовании Wall Street Journal, там приводится ссылка на очень-очень интересный и, как мне кажется, важный опрос, который показывает вообще ситуацию.
The position of the Democratic Party is liberal. The key issues include unemployment, inflation, economy, finance. On issues such as the key rate and tariffs, the opinion of experts is needed because not everyone has a clear point of view on whether the rate should be lowered or not. but most have an opinion on immigration, whether immigrants are useful, whether immigration flows should be increased, whether illegal immigrants should be legalized. The issue of immigration is a topic on which everyone can speak.
Нужно ли больше иммиграционных виз или нет? Нужно ли легализовывать нелегальных иммигрантов или нет? И поэтому вопрос иммиграции – это та тема, на которую все могут высказаться.
The issue of immigration unites a majority of Americans. According to a CBS News and YouGov poll, 54% of voters support the mass deportation tactics proposed by Donald Trump. This goal of deporting illegal immigrants is gaining broad support, including some Democratic Party supporters. This is not a liberal position, not the idea of legalizing everyone, not the concept of open borders, and not granting asylums to illegal immigrants.
Это совсем не либеральная цель. Это не идея легализовать всех. Это не идея открытых границ. Это не идея убежищ для нелегальных иммигрантов.
This is a non-progressive leftist idea. It's a topic that largely unites Americans, with the exception of Jeffrey Epstein. Democrats appear to have lost, not because of a lack of time to explain their progressive ideas, but because those ideas do not find widespread support among most Americans. The second important point is a study conducted by the Pew Research Center, a major American polling center. For 6 months, they studied the behavior of voters who voted and voters who didn't vote. The results of the massive study were released about a month ago.
Людей, проголосовавших и не проголосовавших, проводили это огромное, очень большое исследование. Оно было опубликовано месяц назад примерно.
According to a Pew Research Center study, non-voters in 2024 would prefer Donald Trump by a margin of between 4 and 20 percentage points, depending on the state. That means that with full turnout, Trump would not only win, but by a larger margin. Kamala Harris, for this study, has sometimes been accused by the Pew Research Center of underrating Trump, but the center cannot be accused of being biased in favor of Donald Trump. According to a semi-annual Pew Research Center survey, Kamala Harris received fewer votes than Joe Biden among groups that have traditionally supported the Democratic Party: young adults, Hispanics, Black voters, and swing voters. Donald Trump, by contrast, received more votes than he did when he lost in 2020. These groups were thought by Democrats to be mobilized by progressive leftist ideas, but it turned out that they were more effectively mobilized by Donald Trump's approaches. The economy, financial issues, and illegal immigration are key themes. The Democratic Party is fractured and has many complexities. However, there is movement toward the center and attempts to change things. It is too early to talk about the presidential or congressional elections that will be held in November 2026. It was particularly interesting to hear the views of Anne Applebaum, a well-known scholar and historian. She gave a great interview with Konstantin Egert on Deutsche Welle.
Мне интересно было очень услышать мнение Энн Applebaum, замечательной ученой, историка. Она дала большое интервью Константину Эггерту на Deutsche Welle.
Igor, I apologize. I watched not only your interview, sometimes others too. I'll forgive you this time. Anne Applebaum is a well-known historian, author of a book on the Holodomor. She knows the region well and lives part of the time in Poland. In an interview with Konstantin Egert on Deutsche Welle, she explained that there is no single opposition leader in the United States right now. According to her, a prominent figure may not emerge until the next presidential campaign, until the primaries are held in 2 or 3 years. Now about 10 politicians are beginning to enjoy growing support from voters. Among them are prominent governors and senators. Remarkably, half of them are centrists, and some are right-wing Democrats. It is the right-wing Democrats who are really popular today. If they can move the party slightly toward the center, the Democratic Party has a chance to turn things around.
То у демократической партии, как гениально точно вы сказали, помните, была такая партия, действительно, абсолютно мы ничего про них не слышим. Если им удастся как-то сдвинуть партию к центру, то ситуация, конечно, изменится, и изменится и для демократов.
Now we can expect more centrist and balanced ideas to emerge, perhaps even right-wing ideas. In U.S. history in the 1970-1990s, there were right-wing Democrats who took positions to the right of many Republicans, and left-wing Republicans who were to the left of some of the Democrats. This has actually happened at various times in American history. Today, there is extreme political polarization. If the Democratic Party manages to shift toward the center, it could regain its position. For now, its rating remains the lowest in 35 years.
У них действительно рейтинг самый маленький, самый слабый за 35 лет.
Thanks, Alexandra, for the detailed insights. Our guest was political scientist and Americanist Alexandra Filippenko, PhD in history. Don't forget to subscribe, leave questions, and share this conversation. We'll address them in future broadcasts.